Welcome to Cozy Jury. Tonight's story will test you. It's messy, it's complicated, and by the end, you will decide who's right and who's wrong. But before we begin, if you value what we're building here, hit like. Subscribe if you want more of this, but only if this is your kind of content. I'd rather earn it than beg for it. Drop a comment. Where are you right now and what time is it? I love knowing who's out there deliberating with us. Now get comfortable. You're not just listening. You're the jury. The fire's burning. The case is open. Let's begin. Juan Luis Vega opened the safe deposit envelope. Empty. The medical records were gone, all of them. The file labeled Camilo Vega Montes dated back 7 years, containing every X-ray, every diagnosis, every prescription that documented his son's partial paralysis. It was 5:30 in the morning in Chicago, in the cramped third-floor apartment on the South Side, where Juan had lived for the past decade with his wife Mariela and their son. The early light filtered weakly through Venetian blinds, casting thin shadows across the worn hardwood floor. Juan's hands trembled as he held the empty envelope, the paper crinkling in the silence of the apartment. He could hear the distant rumble of the Blue Line train passing a few blocks away, the familiar sound that usually signaled the start of another day. But today that sound felt ominous, like a warning bell he should have heard years ago. He stood there in the narrow hallway outside their bedroom, barefoot on the cold floor, wearing the same grey sweatpants and faded Chicago Bears t-shirt he'd slept in. The envelope had been tucked behind a loose baseboard panel near the linen closet, a hiding spot he'd discovered years ago when they first moved into this place. He'd kept important documents there, birth certificates, insurance papers, and Camilo's complete medical history from the accident. The accident that happened when Camilo was 11 years old, the accident that left their son unable to walk without assistance, confined to a wheelchair for most activities, dependent on his father for nearly everything. The accident that Juan had replayed in his mind 10,000 times, wondering if there was something he could have done differently, some way he could have prevented it. But now, standing here with an empty envelope, Juan felt something crack open inside his chest. Not grief this time. Not the familiar weight of guilt he'd carried for 7 years. This was different. This was fear laced with something darker, something that tasted like betrayal. Because these records hadn't disappeared on their own. Someone had taken them. Someone who knew exactly where they were hidden. Someone who lived in this apartment. Juan's mind stuttered, trying to reject what his hands were telling him. Maybe he'd moved them. Maybe he'd filed them somewhere else and forgotten. Maybe Mariela had taken them to make copies for the new insurance claim she'd mentioned last month. Maybe there was a simple explanation, something innocent, something that didn't require him to question the foundation of his entire life. But even as he tried to convince himself, he knew because just yesterday, Dr. Mendez had pulled him aside at the clinic where they'd taken Camilo for his quarterly checkup. Dr. Mendez, the new physician who'd recently joined the practice after Dr. Chen retired. Dr. Mendez, who'd looked at Camilo's current X-rays with a puzzled expression, then asked to see the historical records. Dr. Mendez, who'd said, very quietly, very carefully, that something didn't add up, that the injury patterns he was seeing didn't match the diagnosis that had been made 7 years ago. That someone needed to look at the original documentation, the records from the emergency room, the initial assessments. And then Dr. Mendez had done something that still made Juan's stomach turn. He'd leaned in close, glanced around to make sure no one else was listening, and said, in Spanish-accented English, "Mr. Vega, I need you to do something that might sound strange. Don't go home tonight. Take Camilo somewhere safe, a friend's house, a hotel, anywhere but your home, and tomorrow you need to make a call to the authorities, to someone who can investigate this properly I can't say more than that right now, not without proof. But I'm asking you, as a doctor who cares about your son's well-being, please trust me on this. Juan had stood there in the sterile hallway of the clinic, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of disinfectant sharp in his nostrils, and felt his reality tilt sideways. He'd asked what Dr. Mendez meant, what authorities, investigate what. But the doctor had only shaken his head, pressed a business card into Juan's hand, and said he'd say more once Juan had the original records in front of them, once they could compare, once they could see what had really happened that day 7 years ago. Now, holding this empty envelope, Juan understood why Dr. Mendez had been so cryptic, why he'd seemed almost afraid. Because if those records showed something different from what Juan had been told, if they revealed that Camilo's injury wasn't what everyone claimed it was, then someone had been lying for 7 years. And the most terrifying part wasn't just the lie itself. It was that whoever was lying had just destroyed the evidence. Juan's heart hammered against his ribs. His mouth had gone dry. He felt the apartment closing in around him, the familiar walls suddenly unfamiliar, every shadow potentially concealing something he'd been too blind to see. He carefully folded the envelope and slipped it into his pocket, then walked on silent feet back to the bedroom. Mariela was still sleeping, her back to him, her breathing deep and even under the faded blue comforter they'd bought at a discount furniture store when they first got married. Her dark hair spread across the pillow, streaked now with grey she kept meaning to dye but never found time for. She looked peaceful, innocent. Like the woman he'd fallen in love with 23 years ago, the woman who'd worked double shifts as a medical billing specialist to support the family after Juan had given up his job at the auto repair shop to care for Camilo full-time. But appearances could deceive. Juan knew that now. He stood there watching his wife sleep, and for the first time in their marriage, he wondered if he knew her at all. That's what Juan walked into. That empty envelope, that missing evidence, that moment of realization that everything he'd believed about his life, about his family, about his son's accident, might be built on a foundation of lies. Now you might think you know exactly what happened here. Missing medical records, a doctor's cryptic warning, a wife who's suddenly a suspect. Simple case of deception, right? But it's not that simple. Because this empty envelope wasn't the end. It was the trigger for a war that would tear apart a family that had already been through hell. A war that would force Juan to question every memory, every moment, every decision he had made over the past 7 years. What Juan didn't know yet was that this missing documentation went deeper than just concealed medical evidence. Before this story ends, there will be police investigations and family devastation and revelations that will make you question who the real victim is. And there will be a choice that half of you will call justice and the other half will call betrayal. Was Juan right to do what he did next? Hold that thought. Let's go back to the beginning, to the very first moment when Juan and Mariela became a family. To understand this case, you need to see what they built together, what they believed in, and what they stood to lose. Because 7 years ago, before Camilo's accident, before the paralysis, before the endless medical appointments and the surrendered dreams, the Vega family looked completely different. They looked happy. They looked normal. They looked like any other working-class family trying to make it in Chicago's unpredictable economy. Juan had met Mariela in 2002 at a community center dance on the near west side, back when that neighborhood was still affordable for families like theirs. He was 29, she was 26. Juan had recently emigrated from Morelia, Michoacán, carrying with him the skills his father had taught him, the ability to take apart an engine and put it back together better than it was before. He'd found work at Rodriguez Auto Repair on 18th Street, a busy shop that serviced everything from beaten-up Hondas to vintage Chevys. He was good with his hands, patient with difficult problems, the kind of mechanic who'd stay late to make sure a customer's car was truly fixed, not just temporarily patched. Mariella had been born in Chicago, second generation, her parents having made the journey north decades earlier. She had that particular confidence that came from knowing the city, understanding its rhythms, speaking English without an accent, and Spanish with the comfortable fluency of home. She worked in medical billing at a large hospital network downtown, navigating insurance codes and payment disputes with the same determination her parents had used to build a life in a new country. She wore professional clothes, carried herself with purpose, had ambitions beyond just surviving. She wanted to climb, to advance, to eventually manage her own team and maybe, one day, open a consulting firm that helped small medical practices navigate the Byzantine world of healthcare payments. The night they met, Juan had been dragged to the dance by his roommate, Tomas, who insisted that Juan worked too much and needed to remember how to have fun. Juan had agreed reluctantly, showing up in his best jeans and a button-down shirt, feeling awkward and out of place among the crowd of people who seemed to know each other, who moved with ease across the decorated gymnasium floor. He'd been standing near the punch bowl, seriously considering leaving, when Mariella walked up and asked him to dance. Not in a flirtatious way, not with any particular expectation, just a straightforward question from a woman who liked to dance and had noticed a man standing alone, looking uncomfortable. Juan said yes, mostly because saying no would have been more awkward, and they moved on to the floor as a cumbia started playing. He was a decent dancer, his mother had made sure of that, and Mariella was better than decent. They moved well together, falling into an easy rhythm that surprised them both. When the song ended, they stood there for a moment, slightly breathless, and Mariella smiled at him, a real smile that reached her eyes and said, "You're better than you pretend to be." That was Mariella, direct, perceptive, unafraid to say what she saw. They talked for 2 hours that night, sitting on folding chairs against the wall, shouting over the music about their lives, their families, their hopes. Juan told her about his father's shop in Morelia, about the smell of motor oil and the satisfaction of fixing something broken. Mariella told him about growing up between two worlds, American at school and Mexican at home, and how she'd learned to make that duality a strength rather than a confusion. They discovered they both loved old movies, the black and white ones from the golden age of Mexican cinema, and that they both had a fierce loyalty to family that sometimes felt like a burden and sometimes felt like the only thing that mattered. When the dance ended, Juan walked Mariella to her car, an aging Toyota Corolla that she'd bought herself and maintained meticulously. Before she got in, she handed him a business card with her phone number written on the back in neat handwriting. "Call me," she said. "If you want to." He wanted to. He called her 2 days later, nervous as a teenager, and they went to dinner at a small restaurant in Pilsen that served the best mole he'd had since leaving Mexico. They talked through the entire meal, the conversation flowing as easily as it had at the dance, and when Juan walked Mariella back to her car that night, she kissed him on the cheek and said, "I like you, Juan Luis Vega. I think we should do this again." They did. Again and again. Every weekend at first, then twice during the week as well. They went to movies at the old theaters that still showed Spanish-language films. They walked through Millennium Park on Sunday afternoons, marveling at the bean sculpture and watching tourists take pictures. They cooked together in Juan's cramped apartment kitchen, Mariella teaching him her mother's recipe for pozole, Juan showing her how his abuela made tres leches cake. They talked about everything: politics and religion and family dramas and the thousand small details that make up a life. 6 months in, Mariela took Juan to meet her parents. Her father, Don Miguel, owned a small landscaping business and had the weathered hands of a man who'd worked outdoors his entire life. He interrogated Juan politely but thoroughly, asking about his intentions, his stability, his plans for the future. Her mother, Senora Rosa, fed Juan until he thought he might burst and told him stories about Mariela as a child, the girl who'd organized her dolls into elaborate school scenarios and always insisted on being the teacher. They approved of him, Juan could tell. He was respectful, hard-working, serious about their daughter. The kind of man who would build something solid. A month later, Juan took Mariela to Mexico to meet his family in Morelia. His father, Don Luis, showed her around the repair shop, explaining each tool and its purpose with the pride of a man showing off his life's work. His mother, Doña Carmen, embraced Mariela like she was already a daughter, and whispered to Juan that night that this woman was special, that he shouldn't let her go. They spent a week there, walking through the streets of Morelia's historic center, eating gorditas from street vendors, visiting the cathedral where Juan had been baptized. On their last night in Morelia, Juan and Mariela climbed up to the roof of his parents' house as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. They sat on the warm tiles, their shoulders touching, and Juan took Mariela's hand. "I know it's only been 7 months," he said. "I know that's not very long. But I also know that I want to spend my life with you. I want to build a family with you. I want to grow old with you." Mariela had tears in her eyes, but she was smiling. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it." They got married 4 months later in a small ceremony at St. Pius Church on the south side, followed by a reception in the parish hall where both families and half the neighborhood seemed to show up. Mariela wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her, and Juan wore a suit he'd saved for 2 months to buy. They danced their first dance to Bésame Mucho, and when Juan held Mariela close, he felt like the luckiest man alive. The first years of marriage were good. Hard, but good. They moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment, the one they still lived in, and fell into a routine. Juan worked long days at the shop, coming home with grease under his fingernails and satisfaction in his heart. Mariela continued at the hospital, slowly working her way up from entry-level billing to a senior position handling complex insurance negotiations. They saved money carefully, dreaming of eventually buying a house, maybe opening Juan's own repair shop one day. And then, 3 years into their marriage, Mariela got pregnant. Camilo was born on a cold February morning in 2008, arriving 2 weeks early and announcing his presence with a loud, indignant cry that made both Juan and Mariela laugh through their tears. He was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a full head of dark hair, and his mother's expressive eyes. Juan held his son for the first time and felt something shift fundamentally in his chest, a reorganization of priorities so profound it was almost physical. This tiny person, this vulnerable life, became the center of everything. Mariela took 12 weeks of maternity leave, then returned to work with the determined efficiency she brought to everything. They couldn't afford for her to stay home longer, not with the bills and the debt from the delivery, even with insurance. Juan's mother came up from Morelia for 2 months to help with childcare, teaching Juan how to change diapers and mix formula and soothe a crying baby at 3 in the morning. When Doña Carmen had to return to Mexico, They found a neighbor, Senora Martinez, who watched Camilo during the day for a price they could barely afford, but had no choice but to pay. Those early years with Camilo were exhausting and wonderful. Juan would come home from the shop, covered in oil and tired to his bones, and Camilo would squeal with delight and reach for him, and suddenly the exhaustion didn't matter. They celebrated every milestone, first smile, first tooth, first word, which was Papa, much to Mariella's mock indignation. They took Camilo to the park on weekends, pushing him on the swings and catching him at the bottom of the slide. They read to him every night, a rotation of books in Spanish and English, building a bilingual world for their son. Mariella was a fierce mother, organized, efficient, determined that Camilo would have every opportunity. She researched the best public schools in their area, planned their budget to allow for enrichment activities, made sure Camilo's pediatrician appointments were never missed. She was working toward a promotion at the hospital, managing larger accounts, taking on more responsibility. She'd talk about her career goals at dinner, how she was being considered for a team leader position, how eventually she wanted to transition into consulting where the real money was. Juan supported her ambitions fully. He was proud of her drive, her intelligence, her refusal to be limited by circumstances. They were partners, building a life together, both contributing in their own ways. Juan with his steady income and his reliable presence, Mariella with her upward trajectory and her strategic thinking about their future. Camilo thrived. He was a bright, energetic boy, curious about everything, constantly asking questions. Why is the sky blue? Where do cars go when they die? How does the refrigerator make things cold? Juan loved answering his questions, taking them seriously, explaining how things worked in terms a child could understand. On weekends, Juan would sometimes take Camilo to the shop, showing him the tools, letting him hand over wrenches, teaching him the basics of how engines functioned. When Camilo started school, he excelled. Smart like his mother, curious like his father, friendly and well-liked by teachers and classmates. He joined the soccer team in 3rd grade, and Juan and Mariella never missed a game, standing on the sidelines cheering louder than anyone. Camilo wasn't the best player, but he tried hard, and that was what mattered. He had friends, birthday parties at Chuck E. Cheese, sleepovers that left the apartment chaotic, but full of life. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. Not perfectly. Money was always tight, and there were stresses and arguments like any marriage, but basically, fundamentally, they were on track. They were building the life they'd dreamed about on that rooftop in Morelia. They were happy. And then came the fall. It happened at school during recess, on a Tuesday afternoon in October when Camilo was 11 years old. Juan got the call at the shop. It was the school principal, her voice tense and apologetic. There had been an accident. Camilo had fallen from the playground equipment, from the top of the climbing structure, a fall of about 8 feet onto the rubberized surface below. He'd hit his head. He wasn't moving right. The ambulance was on its way. Juan's world stopped. He dropped everything, literally left a car half dismantled on the lift, and ran. He called Mariella from his truck, his hands shaking so badly he could barely dial. She met him at the hospital, and they held each other in the emergency room waiting area, praying in whispered Spanish, making bargains with God. Please let him be okay. Please let him wake up. We'll do anything. Camilo did wake up, but he couldn't move his legs. The doctors said he'd suffered a spinal injury, a compression fracture at the thoracic level. They said it was serious but potentially recoverable. They said he'd need surgery, physical therapy, time. They said a lot of things that Juan only half heard through the roaring in his ears. The surgery happened 2 days later, a 6-hour procedure that felt like 6 years. Juan and Mariella sat in the waiting room, surrounded by Mariella's parents and Juan's brother, who'd driven up from Indianapolis. They didn't talk much. There wasn't anything to say. They just waited. Camilo survived the surgery, but the paralysis remained. Partial, the doctors said. Some sensation, some limited movement. With aggressive physical therapy, he might regain more function. Or he might not. It was too early to tell. They needed to wait and see. Looking back now, Juan could see the moments he'd dismissed. The small things that hadn't seemed significant at the time, but maybe should have. Like the way Mariella had insisted on being the one to speak with all the doctors, translating their medical jargon for Juan, who struggled with English medical terms. The way she'd organized all of Camilo's records herself, filing everything meticulously, telling Juan not to worry about the paperwork. The way she'd seemed almost relieved when Dr. Chen, Camilo's primary physician, had said the paralysis was likely permanent, that they should focus on adaptation rather than recovery. At the time, Juan had thought Mariella was just being practical, being strong for the family, taking charge because someone had to. Now, holding that empty envelope, he wondered if there was another explanation, a darker one. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Back then, in those first terrible weeks after the accident, Juan and Mariella were united in their grief and determination. They would do whatever it took to help Camilo adjust to his new reality. They would be strong for him. They would make sure he still had a good life, even if it was different from the life they'd imagined. That solidarity wouldn't last long. The medical bills started arriving within weeks of Camilo's accident, thick envelopes with amounts that made Juan's hands shake when he opened them. Surgery, hospital stay, specialists, medical equipment, the beginning of what would be years of physical therapy. Their insurance covered some of it, but the deductibles and co-pays and out-of-network charges added up to tens of thousands of dollars they didn't have. Mariella handled the bills, negotiating payment plans, fighting with insurance companies, applying for financial assistance programs. She spent hours on the phone in the evenings, her voice tight with frustration, arguing with claims representatives who seemed determined to deny every request. Juan kept working at the shop, but his mind wasn't in it anymore. He'd be in the middle of an oil change and suddenly think of Camilo lying in that hospital bed, and his hands would freeze. He started making mistakes, small ones at first, forgetting to tighten a bolt or misdiagnosing a problem. His boss, Mr. Rodriguez, was understanding at first. "Family comes first," he said. "Take the time you need." But as weeks turned into months and Juan's performance didn't improve, the understanding began to wear thin. The real crisis came about 4 months after the accident. Camilo was home by then, his bedroom converted into something resembling a hospital room, with a specialized bed, a wheelchair, grab bars installed in the bathroom. He needed help with almost everything, getting dressed, using the toilet, moving from bed to chair. The physical therapist came 3 times a week, putting Camilo through exercises that made him cry from pain and frustration. Between therapy sessions, someone needed to continue the exercises at home, stretching Camilo's legs, helping him build what strength remained in his core. Mariella couldn't do it. She was working full-time, the family's main income, now that Juan's hours had been cut. She left at 7 in the morning and often didn't get home until 7 at night, sometimes later, when she had to stay late for important meetings or deadlines. She'd come home exhausted, grab something quick to eat, then spend more hours on the phone dealing with insurance companies or researching adaptive equipment or coordinating with Camilo's growing team of medical providers. Senora Martinez couldn't do it either. She was in her 70s and didn't have the physical strength to lift Camilo or the knowledge to properly perform his exercises. She could sit with him, keep him company, make sure he was safe. but she couldn't provide the intensive care he needed. So it fell to Juan. He started leaving work early to get home by 3, when Camilo got out of the special education program the school had placed him in. He'd help Camilo with his exercises, make dinner, help with homework, manage the evening routine of medications and adjustments and preparations for the next day. He was exhausted, physically and emotionally. And his work was suffering more and more. The conversation with Mr. Rodriguez happened on a Friday afternoon in February, 5 months after the accident. Juan had left work early again, the 3rd time that week, because Camilo had a doctor's appointment. When he arrived at the shop on Monday morning, Mr. Rodriguez asked to speak with him privately in the office. "Juan, you're one of my best mechanics," Mr. Rodriguez said, sitting behind his cluttered desk, his expression sympathetic but firm. "But I can't keep doing this. You're leaving early constantly. You're distracted when you're here. You've made 3 significant mistakes in the past month that cost us money and could have cost us a customer. I understand what you're going through, I really do, but I have a business to run." Juan nodded, his throat tight. He knew what was coming. "I'm not firing you," Mr. Rodriguez continued, "but I need to know what you plan to do. Can you commit to being here, really being here, full time, or do you need to make a different choice?" Juan had driven home that night in silence, the radio off, just the sound of Chicago traffic around him. He sat in his truck outside their apartment building for 20 minutes before going inside, trying to figure out what to do. They needed his income. They couldn't survive on just Mariella's salary, not with the medical bills. But Camilo needed him too. His son needed him in a way that was immediate and non-negotiable. When he finally went inside, Mariella was at the kitchen table, her laptop open, surrounded by medical bills and insurance statements. Camilo was in his room, doing homework with Senora Martinez's help. Juan sat down across from Mariella and told her about the conversation with Mr. Rodriguez. "So quit," Mariella said immediately, not looking up from her computer. Juan stared at her. "Quit. We can't afford that." "We'll make it work." Mariella's voice was clipped, efficient, the tone she used when solving a problem. "I'm up for the team leader promotion. If I get it, that's a 20% raise. We can stretch that. And you being home full-time with Camilo means we don't have to pay Senora Martinez anymore. That's $800 a month right there. That's not enough to replace my salary. Then I'll take on extra freelance consulting work. I've been thinking about it anyway. There's good money in that." Mariella finally looked up at him, her eyes hard. "Juan, our son needs you. That has to come first. We'll figure out the money." They talked for another hour, running numbers, making plans, both of them trying to sound more confident than they felt. In the end, they agreed. Juan would give Mr. Rodriguez 2 weeks' notice. He'd become Camilo's full-time caregiver, managing his medical needs, doing his exercises, taking him to appointments, being there in the way their son needed. It was supposed to be temporary. Just until Camilo was more independent, just until they figured out a better system, just until things stabilized. 7 years later, Juan was still at home, and things had never stabilized. That decision, noble as it seemed, was the first crack in their marriage. Not obvious at first, just a hairline fracture in the foundation. Juan threw himself into caring for Camilo with the same dedication he'd once brought to his work. He learned everything he could about spinal injuries, about physical therapy techniques, about adaptive equipment. He became an expert at transferring Camilo from wheelchair to car, from bed to bathroom. He learned to read the subtle signs of pressure sores before they developed, to adjust Camilo's sitting position throughout the day, to manage the medications and stretches and exercises that filled their daily routine. Camilo slowly improved. Not dramatically, not the miraculous recovery they'd hoped for, but incrementally, painstakingly, he regained some function. He could move his toes by the 1-year mark. He could flex his ankles by 18 months. He developed enough core strength to sit unsupported for extended periods. He learned to use a walker for short distances, though the wheelchair remained necessary for anything more than moving around their small apartment. Juan was proud of his son's progress, proud of his own role in facilitating it. He told himself that giving up his career had been worth it, that this was what fathers did. They sacrificed for their children. He told himself that when Camilo was older, more independent, he could go back to work, that this wasn't permanent. But as the months turned into years, that possibility seemed increasingly distant. Camilo's needs didn't decrease, they just changed. Physical therapy continued 3 times a week, every week. Doctor's appointments remained frequent. And as Camilo got older, bigger, heavier, the physical demands on Juan increased. Transferring a 70-pound 11-year-old was one thing. Transferring a 130-pound 16-year-old was entirely different. Meanwhile, Mariella's career took off. She got the promotion, then another one 2 years later. She started doing consulting work on the side, building a reputation as an expert in medical billing optimization. Her income grew steadily, which was good because they needed every dollar. But it also meant she was home less and less. Early mornings, late nights, occasional weekend work. She was supporting the family, carrying the financial burden that Juan no longer could, and resenting it. That resentment came out in small ways at first. Comments about the groceries Juan had bought. Why did he get the expensive brand? They couldn't afford that. Observations about the state of the apartment. Couldn't he at least keep things cleaner if he was home all day? Questions about whether Camilo really needed so many doctor's appointments. Maybe some of them were unnecessary. Maybe Juan was being overprotective. Juan swallowed those comments, told himself that Mariela was just stressed, that she didn't mean to be cruel. He tried harder, budgeted more carefully, cleaned more obsessively, questioned his own judgment about Camilo's care. He bent over backwards to make things easier for Mariela, to show her that his role at home was valuable, even if it didn't bring in money. But the resentment kept growing on both sides. Juan resented Mariela's increasing absence from Camilo's daily life, the way she seemed to view their son as an obligation to be managed rather than a person to be present with. Mariela resented Juan's inability to see the bigger picture, his focus on Camilo to the exclusion of everything else, including her needs, including their marriage. They still functioned as a family unit. They went through the motions. But the warmth that had once characterized their relationship cooled into something more transactional. You do this, I'll do that. You take care of Camilo. I'll bring in the money. You manage the home, I'll manage our financial future. It worked, in a mechanical sense. The bills got paid, Camilo was cared for, the apartment was maintained. But the partnership they'd built, the love story that had started at a community center dance, felt increasingly like a distant memory. Looking back, there were signs that things were worse than Juan realized. Mariela's increasing secrecy about her work, the way she'd close her laptop when Juan entered the room, the phone calls she'd take in the bedroom, with the door closed. The weekend last year when she'd said she had to go to a conference in Indianapolis and came back seeming different, distracted, avoiding eye contact. The life insurance policy she'd taken out on Juan without discussing it with him first, presenting it as a practical necessity that he'd only found out about when the paperwork arrived in the mail. At the time, Juan had explained all of it away. Mariela worked with confidential patient information. Of course, she was protective of her computer. The conference was a career opportunity. She needed to network. The life insurance was responsible planning. If something happened to him, Mariela and Camilo would be taken care of. Every concerning thing had a reasonable explanation, if you wanted to believe it. Juan wanted to believe it, desperately, because believing his wife was exactly who she appeared to be meant his life made sense. It meant his sacrifice had meaning. It meant his family was intact even if it wasn't perfect. But then came the doctor's appointment yesterday with Dr. Mendez. And suddenly, all those reasonable explanations started to look like something else entirely. Now Juan stood in his apartment at 5:30 in the morning, holding an empty envelope, and he couldn't explain it away anymore. Someone had taken those medical records. Someone who knew where they were, someone who had access to this apartment, someone who had a reason to want those documents to disappear, and the only person who fit that description was his wife. You might think this is already clear-cut. Missing evidence, suspicious behavior, a doctor's warning. But wait, because what Juan didn't know yet was that this envelope was just the beginning. The records weren't just missing, they'd been altered long before they disappeared. And the person who'd altered them had a reason that would complicate everything Juan thought he understood about his marriage, his sacrifice, and the accident that had changed all their lives. That Tuesday afternoon 7 years ago, when Juan got the call about Camilo's fall, he wasn't the first person contacted. The school had called Mariela first. She was listed as the primary emergency contact because her English was better, because she worked downtown and could theoretically get to the school faster than Juan could from the south side. The school had reached Mariela at 10:45 in the morning, told her about the accident, told her an ambulance was being called. Mariela had not gone directly to the school. She'd made several other calls first. Phone records would later show this, though Juan didn't know it yet. She'd called her manager, told them she had a family emergency and needed to leave. She'd called Camilo's regular pediatrician, Dr. Chen, on her personal cell phone, a number Mariela should not have had. She'd called someone else, a number registered to a medical supply company, and spoken for 17 minutes. And only then, nearly an hour after the school's initial call, had she called Juan. By the time Juan arrived at the emergency room, Mariela had already been there for 30 minutes. She'd already spoken with the first doctors who examined Camilo. She'd already provided his medical history, or a version of it. She'd already filled out paperwork and signed consents and established herself as the primary contact for all medical decisions. Juan, frantic and terrified, had been grateful for this. Grateful that Mariela was organized, that she could communicate with the doctors, that she could understand the medical terminology being thrown around. He'd let her take the lead, stood beside her nodding, trusting that she was advocating for their son in the way she knew best. What if that trust had been misplaced? What if Mariela's efficiency in those first critical hours hadn't been about helping Camilo, but about controlling the narrative? What if everything that happened after the diagnosis, the surgery, the prognosis, had been based on information Mariela had carefully curated? These were the questions spinning through Juan's mind as he stood in his apartment, the empty envelope in his pocket, his wife sleeping peacefully in their bed. These were the implications of Dr. Mendez's warning, the reason he'd told Juan to leave his own home, to contact authorities. Because if Mariela had lied about Camilo's injury, if she'd somehow influenced his treatment or his records, then Juan's entire reality for the past 7 years was a fiction. His sacrifice, his dedication, his transformation into a full-time caregiver, all of it would have been based on a false premise. But why? That was the question that made Juan's head spin. Why would Mariela do such a thing? What possible reason could she have for wanting Camilo to remain disabled, for preventing his recovery, for destroying evidence? The only answer Juan could think of was too terrible to fully contemplate. but he forced himself to think it anyway, standing there in the grey morning light filtering through their apartment windows. If Camilo recovered fully, if he became independent again, then Juan could go back to work. He could return to being a mechanic, contributing financially, being more than just a caregiver. He could reclaim his identity, his purpose beyond Camilo's needs. And if Juan went back to work, Mariela would lose her excuse for the long hours, the constant absence, the separate life she'd built for herself. She'd have to be present again, accountable, part of a family that actually functioned as a unit, rather than a collection of individuals pursuing their own interests. Was that possible? Could Mariela really have sabotaged their own son's recovery to maintain her freedom? It seemed too monstrous to believe. And yet, holding that empty envelope, Juan couldn't dismiss the possibility. He needed to know the truth, but he also needed to be smart about how he pursued it. Dr. Mendez had told him to contact authorities, but what would he say? That his wife had taken some medical records? That wasn't a crime, not obviously. That he suspected she'd lied about their son's condition, based on what evidence? The records were gone. It would be his word against hers, and Mariela was articulate, credible, well established in the medical community through her work. Juan was just a former mechanic who'd spent the last 7 years at home, whose English was accented, who had no proof of anything beyond a doctor's cryptic warning and an empty envelope. He needed more. He needed to understand what had really happened 7 years ago, needed to find some piece of evidence that couldn't be explained away, needed to build a case that someone would actually believe. But he also needed to protect Camilo. That was paramount. Whatever else was true, whatever Mariela had or hadn't done, Camilo was innocent in all of this. Camilo was just a kid who'd suffered a terrible injury and had worked incredibly hard to recover as much as he had. He didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of whatever war was about to erupt between his parents. So Juan made a decision. He would follow Dr. Mendez's advice, at least partially. He wouldn't sleep at home tonight. He'd take Camilo somewhere safe, somewhere Mariela couldn't access easily, and he'd start investigating quietly, carefully, without tipping Mariela off that he knew anything was wrong. It was 6 in the morning now. Juan moved silently through the apartment, packing a bag for himself and Camilo. A few changes of clothes, medications, toiletries, Camilo's school supplies. He packed carefully, taking only things Mariela wouldn't immediately notice were missing. He'd tell her they were going to visit his brother in Indianapolis for a few days, a spontaneous trip to break up the routine. Mariela would probably be relieved, actually. A few days with the apartment to herself, no caregiving needs to navigate around. At 7, Juan woke Camilo. His son was groggy, confused about the early wake-up. "We're going on an adventure," Juan said, forcing cheerfulness into his voice. "Uncle Miguel invited us to visit. You can miss a few days of school." Camilo's face brightened. He loved his uncle, and trips anywhere were rare enough to be exciting. "Really? Just us?" "Just us guys. Mom has to work. It'll be fun." As Juan helped Camilo get dressed, transfer to his wheelchair, complete his morning routine, he felt his chest tighten with emotion. His son trusted him completely, depended on him for everything. And Juan was about to drag him into something that could destroy their family forever. But what choice did he have, if there was even a chance that Camilo could have recovered more than he had, that his disability had been prolonged or exaggerated by someone who should have been protecting him? Then Juan had to investigate. He had to know he owed his son that much. At 7:30, as Juan was loading their bags into his truck, Mariella emerged from the apartment. She was dressed for work, her hair pulled back, her expression preoccupied. "Where are you going?" she asked, her tone more curious than concerned. "Indianapolis. Miguel invited us to visit. We'll be back Friday." Juan kept his voice casual, though his heart was racing. Mariella frowned slightly. "Miguel invited you? When did this happen?" "He called yesterday while you were at work. Camilo's excited about it." "You couldn't have mentioned this last night? You got home late? You were tired. I didn't want to bother you." Mariella studied him for a moment, and Juan wondered if she could see through the lie. But then she just shrugged. "Fine. Have a good time. Call me when you get there." "I will." Juan turned to help Camilo into the truck, his hands shaking slightly as he secured the wheelchair in the back. As they drove away, Juan glanced in the rearview mirror. Mariella was standing on the sidewalk, watching them leave. Even from a distance, even through the mirror, Juan could see something in her posture. Tension, suspicion. Or maybe he was just projecting his own fears onto her, seeing threats where there were none. He forced himself to focus on the road ahead. They weren't actually going to Indianapolis. He'd lied about that too. He was taking Camilo to a motel on the northwest side, a place far enough from their neighborhood that Mariella wouldn't think to look for them there. It wasn't ideal, but it was temporary. Just until Juan figured out what to do next. Camilo chattered happily from the passenger seat, excited about the unexpected trip, about seeing his uncle, about missing school. He had no idea that his father's hands were gripping the steering wheels so tightly they'd gone white, that his father's mind was spinning with fears and suspicions that could shatter everything Camilo believed about his family. Juan let his son talk, responding with half attention, his mind elsewhere. On that empty envelope, on Dr. Mendez's warning, on 7 years of sacrifice that might have been built on a lie. The motel was nothing special, a 2-story budget chain near O'Hare Airport, the kind of place where truckers and delayed travelers stayed when they needed cheap, clean, and temporary. Juan checked them in using cash he'd withdrawn from an ATM that morning, registering under his brother's name, just in case. The room was small but adequate, 2 double beds, a bathroom that smelled faintly of industrial cleaner, a window that overlooked the parking lot, and offered a view of planes taking off in the distance. Camilo was puzzled by the detour. "I thought we were going to Uncle Miguel's." "We are," Juan said, the lies coming easier now. "Tomorrow. I wanted to break up the drive. Plus, you like watching planes?" It was true. Camilo did love planes. He spent the next hour sitting by the window, tracking the jets as they climbed into the sky, asking Juan questions about how they worked, where they were going, what it would be like to fly somewhere far away. Juan answered as best he could, grateful for the distraction, for these moments where he could just be a father explaining the world to his curious son. But once Camilo was settled, watching a movie on the small television, Juan knew he couldn't put it off any longer. He needed to call Dr. Mendez. He needed to figure out what came next. He stepped outside into the parking lot, the late morning air cold against his face, and dialed the number on the card Dr. Mendez had given him. The doctor answered on the second ring. "Mr. Vega, I was hoping you'd call. Are you somewhere safe?" "Yes, a motel. Camilo is with me, but I don't understand what's happening." "The records you wanted to see, they're gone. Someone took them." There was a pause on the line. When Dr. Mendez spoke again, his voice was heavy. "That's not surprising. Whoever is responsible would have wanted to eliminate evidence. But Mr. Vega, there are other records. Hospital records, emergency room reports from the day of the accident. Those can't be erased as easily." "What do you think you'll find in those records?" Another pause. I don't want to say until I'm certain. But Mr. Vega, I've been a doctor for 23 years. I've seen hundreds of spinal injuries. And what I saw on Camillo's current x-rays, the bone structure, the fusion patterns, the way the injury is healed, it doesn't match what I'd expect from the type of fall that was reported. It looks more like, and I hesitate to say this without more evidence, but it looks more like an injury that was treated incorrectly from the beginning, or possibly one that was allowed to worsen when it could have been prevented. Juan's stomach dropped. Are you saying someone hurt him intentionally? No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that the injury might not be as severe as the documentation suggests. That with proper treatment from the beginning, Camillo might have recovered more function than he currently has. But to prove that, I need those original hospital records, and I need you to trust me enough to let me contact the hospital's medical records department and the appropriate authorities. Authorities? You mean police? Possibly. Or medical board investigators, depending on what the records show. Mr. Vega, if what I suspect is true, someone committed medical fraud. They falsified or misrepresented Camillo's condition, possibly to gain some benefit or to avoid some consequence. That's serious. That's criminal. Juan leaned against his truck, his legs suddenly weak. My wife is a medical billing specialist. She works with insurance companies. She handles all of our documentation. Dr. Mendez was quiet for a long moment. I see. The records were falsified. If insurance companies paid for treatments that weren't necessary or that weren't effective because they were based on wrong information, that would be fraud. That would be her committing fraud. It's one possibility. But Mr. Vega, let's not jump to conclusions. Let me get the hospital records first. Let me compare them to what I'm seeing in Camillo's current condition. Then we'll know what we're dealing with. How long will that take? A few days at least. Patient privacy laws make it complicated. I'll need to submit a formal request, possibly get a court order. But I have a colleague who works in medical ethics review. I think I can expedite this through proper channels. Juan rubbed his face with his free hand. And what do I do in the meantime? Stay where you are, keep Camillo safe, don't confront your wife, not yet. If she knows you're suspicious, she might destroy more evidence. Or worse, she might prevent you from seeing Camillo. Do you understand what I'm saying? If there's a custody issue, if there's any suggestion that Camillo is in danger, you need to be the stable, present parent. You need to document everything. Document everything, Juan repeated numbly. Your routine with Camillo, his current condition, his progress, any communications with your wife. Take photos, keep notes, save text messages. Build a record that shows you're the primary caregiver, that Camillo depends on you, that you've been acting in his best interest. If this goes where I think it might go, you'll need that. After Juan hung up, he sat in his truck for a long time, staring at nothing. Document everything, build a case, prepare for war. This was his life now, not a mechanic, not a husband, not even just a father. Now he was a detective, an investigator, gathering evidence against the woman he'd once loved enough to build a life with. He thought about that night in Morelia on the roof, when he'd asked Mariela to marry him, when the future had seemed so clear, so full of promise, when he'd believed that love and hard work could overcome anything. He'd been so naive. They both had been. Juan went back into the motel room. Camillo had fallen asleep during the movie, exhausted from the early morning and the excitement. Juan sat on the edge of the other bed, watching his son sleep, and felt a wave of protectiveness so fierce it was almost painful. Whatever happened next, whatever he discovered about Mariela, or the accident, or the past 7 years, Juan would make sure Camillo was protected. That was the only thing that mattered now. Not his marriage, not his own hurt feelings, not even the truth itself, just Camillo's well-being and safety. He pulled out his phone and started doing what Dr. Mendez had advised, documenting. He took photos of Camilo sleeping peacefully, of the medications lined up on the nightstand, of the wheelchair folded in the corner. He opened a new note file and started writing down everything he could remember about the accident, about the days and weeks that followed, about the doctors they'd seen and the treatments they'd pursued. The more he wrote, the more gaps he noticed. Times when Mariela had insisted on going to appointments alone, saying Juan needed to rest. Conversations with doctors that Mariela had summarized for him rather than letting him hear directly. Medical decisions that Mariela had made quickly, saying there was no time to discuss. They had to act now. He'd trusted her. Of course he'd trusted her. She was his wife, the mother of his child, a woman who worked in healthcare and understood these systems better than he did. Why wouldn't he trust her? But trust, Juan was learning, could be a weapon. It could be used to manipulate, to control, to obscure the truth. And he'd given Mariela 7 years to perfect that manipulation. Now it was time to take that power back. Time to find out what had really happened to his son. Time to stop being the trusting husband and become the protective father who would do anything, absolutely anything, to make things right. Even if it meant destroying his marriage. Even if it meant admitting his sacrifice had been based on a lie. Even if it meant facing the possibility that the person sleeping in their apartment right now, the woman he'd promised to love forever, might be the villain in this story after all. Juan looked at his sleeping son and made a silent promise. Whatever the truth was, however bad it turned out to be, he would face it. He would fight for Camilo's future. He would not let fear or love or loyalty to Mariela stop him from doing what was right. The evidence gathering had begun, the war was starting, and there was no going back now. Over the next 3 days, while Juan and Camilo stayed hidden in that motel room, while Juan told his son they were waiting for Uncle Miguel to get off work so they could visit, while Camilo happily watched television and did his physical therapy exercises and remained blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around him, Juan's phone became a battleground. Mariela called repeatedly. The first day, she sounded annoyed. Where were they? Why hadn't they arrived in Indianapolis yet? Why wasn't Juan answering her calls? She'd tried Miguel's number, and he seemed confused about the visit. Juan texted back short, vague responses. They'd made a detour. Camilo wanted to see some sights. They'd get to Miguel's eventually. Phone battery was dying, so he couldn't talk much. By the second day, Mariela's tone shifted. Now she sounded worried. Was everything okay? Was Camilo all right? Where exactly were they? She needed to know they were safe. Juan felt a flicker of guilt at her concern. Maybe he was wrong about her. Maybe there was an innocent explanation for the missing records. Maybe he was letting Dr. Mendez's suspicions poison his view of his wife. But then he remembered the empty envelope, the altered timeline on the day of the accident, the 7 years of his life that might have been unnecessary. He texted back, "Everything's fine. Camilo's happy. We're safe. Stop worrying." By the 3rd day, Mariela's messages took on a harder edge. This wasn't okay. She needed to know where they were. If Juan didn't contact her immediately, she'd report them missing. She'd call the police. She had rights as Camilo's mother. That last message made Juan's blood run cold. Threats now, not even disguised as concern, just direct threats. If you don't do what I want, there will be consequences. He didn't respond to that one. Instead, he called Dr. Mendez. "Have you found anything?" Juan asked without preamble. "I have." Dr. Mendez's voice was grim. "Mr. Vega, you need to come to my office. I need to show you something. Can you bring Camilo?" "Is it safe?" "Yes, I've made arrangements. There are people here who can help you, people who specialize in these situations, but you need to see the records yourself. You need to understand what we're dealing with. Juan's heart pounded. Is it bad? It's complicated. Come to my office at 5 today. Use the side entrance. I'll be waiting. Juan spent the rest of the afternoon preparing Camilo for an outing, keeping his voice cheerful, maintaining the fiction that everything was normal. They were going to see the nice doctor, just a checkup, nothing to worry about. Camilo, trusting as always, accepted this. He got himself ready with the independence he'd developed over the years, transferring to his wheelchair, checking that he had everything he needed. He was a good kid, a brave kid, a kid who deserved so much better than what had happened to him. Dr. Mendez's office was in a medical building on the north side, a modern glass structure that housed multiple practices. Juan used the side entrance as instructed, taking an elevator to the 3rd floor. Dr. Mendez was waiting in the hallway, along with 2 other people, a woman in her 50s wearing a professional suit and a younger man with a badge clipped to his belt. "Mr. Vega," Dr. Mendez said, "this is Sarah Chen. She's a patient advocate and medical ethics specialist. And this is Detective Marcus Williams from the Chicago Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. They're here to help." Financial Crimes Unit. That confirmed something at least. Whatever this was, it involved money. They moved into a conference room. Camilo looked nervous now, picking up on the serious atmosphere. Juan squeezed his shoulder. "It's okay, mijo. These people are here to help us." Dr. Mendez spread several documents across the table. X-rays, medical reports, billing statements. He pointed to an X-ray. "This is Camilo's current imaging from last week. You can see the spinal fusion here, the bone growth pattern, the way the injury has healed over 7 years. He pulled out another set of images. "And these are the original X-rays from the emergency room, the day of the accident. I had to get a court order to access these, which is why it took a few days." Juan stared at the images. To his untrained eye, they looked similar. Serious injuries, clearly, but similar. "Now look closely," Dr. Mendez said, pointing to specific areas. "The original injury was severe, yes, but it was also treatable. With immediate surgery and proper intervention, Camilo should have regained at least 80% of his mobility, maybe more." He pulled out a 3rd set of documents. "But here's what was actually done. The surgery was delayed by 3 days. The justification in the medical notes says the family requested the delay to consider options." "But you didn't request that, did you, Mr. Vega?" Juan shook his head, his throat tight. "No, Mariella said the doctors recommended waiting. She said they needed to reduce swelling first." "That's sometimes true, Dean Doctor," Mendez said. "But in Camilo's case, the delay allowed additional damage to occur, damage that was likely preventable." Sarah Chen, the patient advocate, spoke up. "Mr. Vega, we've also reviewed the billing records. Your insurance company paid for extensive physical therapy over the past 7 years. But according to the treatment notes, much of that therapy was focused on maintaining Camilo's current condition rather than improving it. The therapeutic goals were set very low, almost as if the expectation was that Camilo would never recover significantly." Detective Williams opened his own folder. "And here's where it gets interesting from my perspective. The insurance payments for Camilo's care over 7 years total, approximately $460,000. Your wife, as the medical billing specialist handling your case, would have had access to all of that documentation. She would have known exactly how much was being paid out." Juan felt dizzy. "You're saying she made money from this? From keeping Camilo disabled?" "Not directly," the detective said. "But there are other factors. Your wife's career advanced significantly over the past 7 years, correct? Multiple promotions?" "Yes, because she was working hard, because she was supporting the family. Possibly because she had insider knowledge about insurance billing processes, knowledge she gained from managing a complex, high-dollar case. your son's case. There are several instances where your wife negotiated billing disputes that saved her employer significant money, disputes involving treatment authorizations and payment structures very similar to Camilo's situation. Sarah Chen leaned forward. Mr. Vega, we're not saying your wife intentionally injured Camilo. We're not even saying she made the original decision to delay his surgery with malicious intent. What we're suggesting is that once Camilo's disability was established, once the insurance payments started flowing, once your wife saw how it could benefit her career, she may have made choices that prioritized maintaining that situation over helping your son recover. Juan looked at Camilo, who was sitting quietly in his wheelchair, staring at the X-rays of his own spine with a confused expression. His son was 18 now, legally an adult, but in this moment he looked so young, so vulnerable. "Can we prove any of this?" Juan asked. Detective Williams nodded. "We're building a case, but I'll be honest with you, medical fraud is complicated. We'll need expert witnesses, detailed financial analysis, proof of intent. It could take months, maybe longer. And in the meantime, Sarah Chen said gently, you need to make some decisions about Camilo's living situation, about custody, even though he's 18, about who's going to be responsible for his ongoing care and his medical decisions going forward. Mariella will fight me on that. Probably. The detective agreed. Which is why you need a lawyer. A good one. We can provide recommendations. Juan sat back in his chair, overwhelmed. A lawyer, a custody battle, a potential criminal case against his own wife. This was real now. Not just suspicions and empty envelopes, but actual evidence, actual crimes, actual consequences. Dr. Mendez spoke quietly. Mr. Vega, there's one more thing you need to know. Based on these original records, based on what I'm seeing in Camilo's current condition, I believe he could still recover more function. Not completely, the damage is permanent to some degree, but with the right therapy, aggressive intervention, possibly another surgery to correct some of the fusion issues, Camilo could potentially walk with minimal assistance. He could potentially live independently. Camilo's head snapped up at that. Really? I could walk better? Potentially, Dr. Mendez said carefully. It would be hard work, painful, expensive, and there are no guarantees. But yes, mijo, I think there's a chance. Juan watched hope bloom on his son's face, followed quickly by confusion, then anger as Camilo started to process what was being said. Wait, are you saying I could have recovered years ago? That I didn't have to be like this? The room fell silent. This was the moment Juan had been dreading, when Camilo realized the truth, when his son understood that his disability might have been prolonged unnecessarily, that someone had made choices that kept him in that wheelchair longer than he needed to be. We don't know for certain, Juan said carefully, but it's possible. That's what we're trying to find out. Who? Camilo's voice was shaking. Who made those choices? Juan couldn't answer, couldn't make himself say it, but he didn't have to. Camilo was a smart kid. He'd been present for enough medical appointments, heard enough conversations. He knew who made all the medical decisions in their family. He knew who controlled all the information. Mom. Not a question, a realization. Mom did this? We don't know that for sure, Juan started, but Camilo cut him off. She's the one who talks to all the doctors. She's the one who decides everything. You just do what she tells you. Camilo's face was flushed now, angry tears streaming down his cheeks. Why would she do that? Why would she keep me like this? Juan moved to his son, wrapped his arms around him, let Camilo sob against his chest. Over his son's head, he met Dr. Mendez's eyes. The doctor looked pained, but resolute. This was the cost of the truth. This was what happened when you pulled back the curtain. You didn't just expose the lies, you shattered the illusions that had been holding your family together. After Camillo calmed down, after they'd talked through some of the immediate emotions, after the patient advocate had given them resources for family therapy and trauma counseling, Juan and Camillo left the medical building. It was dark now, the Chicago evening cold and sharp. Juan loaded Camillo's wheelchair into the truck, helped his son into the passenger seat, and just sat there for a moment in the driver's seat, his hands on the steering wheel, trying to figure out what to do next. His phone buzzed, another message from Mariela. "I know where you are. I'm coming to get Camillo. You can't keep him from me." Juan's jaw tightened. She was tracking them somehow. His phone, probably. Or maybe she'd called the motel and somehow figured out which one. It didn't matter. She knew they were at this medical building, or she would soon. He started the truck and drove. Not back to the motel. Not to his brother's house in Indianapolis. Somewhere else. Somewhere Mariela wouldn't think to look. He drove to his old workplace, Rodriguez Auto Repair, the shop where he'd spent 10 years of his life before Camillo's accident. It was after hours, but Juan still had his key. Mr. Rodriguez had never asked for it back. He pulled around to the employee parking area behind the building and sat in the darkness, thinking. His phone rang. Mariela. He answered this time. "Where is my son?" No greeting, just that demand. "Our son is with me. He's safe." "You had no right to take him, to hide him from me. What the hell is going on, Juan?" "I know about the records, Mariela. I know they're missing. I know about the delay in his surgery. I know everything." Silence on the line. When Mariela spoke again, her voice was different, harder. "I don't know what you think you know, but you're making a mistake. You're going to destroy this family over some conspiracy theory. It's not a theory. I have the evidence, doctors who will testify, financial records, everything. You have nothing." Mariela's voice was venomous now. "You think some doctor who saw Camillo once is going to convince anyone of anything? I've been managing his care for 7 years. I have relationships with every provider. I have documentation of everything. All you have is paranoia and an empty envelope." So she knew he'd found it, knew he'd discovered the missing records. That confirmed her involvement, even if she didn't realize it. "Why did you do it, Mariela? That's all I want to know. Why?" "I didn't do anything except try to hold this family together while you fell apart. You're the one who gave up your career. You're the one who became so obsessed with Camillo that you forgot we were supposed to be partners. You're the one who checked out of our marriage. I was taking care of our son. You were using our son as an excuse to avoid your own life. You were happy to become his full-time caregiver because it meant you didn't have to face the fact that you were never going to be successful at anything else. You were never going to own your own shop. You were never going to be anything more than a mediocre mechanic. Camillo's disability gave you purpose. It gave you an excuse for your failure." Juan felt those words like physical blows. That's not true, isn't it? Be honest with yourself, Juan. When was the last time you even thought about going back to work? When was the last time you applied for a job, looked for opportunities? You say you want Camillo to recover, but what happens to you if he does? Who are you if you're not his caregiver? Juan couldn't respond because somewhere in that vicious attack there was a grain of truth. He had built his identity around caring for Camillo. He had let it consume him. And yes, there was part of him that feared what would happen if Camillo didn't need him anymore. But that didn't make what Mariela had done right. It didn't justify the lies, the manipulation, the destruction of evidence. "I'm filing for custody," Juan said, finally. Camillo's 18. but he needs a guardian. And it's not going to be you. Try it, Mariella said coldly. I make the money. I have the resources. I have the legal standing. You're a stay-at-home dad with no income and a history of mental instability, remember? All those anxiety attacks you had in the first year after the accident? I have records of those. I have documentation that you couldn't handle the stress, that I had to manage everything because you were falling apart. You documented my trauma as evidence against me. I documented the facts, that's all. The court will interpret them however they want. But I think we both know who they'll believe. The successful professional who's been supporting her family for years, or the unemployed ex-mechanic who kidnapped his son based on some doctor's conspiracy theory. She hung up. Juan sat in his truck, shaking with rage and fear and a terrible certainty that Mariella might be right. She had resources. She had credibility. She had spent years building a case for her own competence and his instability, whether she'd done it intentionally or not. In the passenger seat, Camilo spoke quietly. Dad, I believe you. Whatever Mom is saying, whatever happens, I believe you, and I want to stay with you. Juan looked at his son, this brave, broken, beautiful boy who'd been through so much and felt something solidify in his chest. Determination, resolve, the knowledge that no matter what Mariella threatened, no matter what resources she brought to bear, Juan had one thing she didn't. He had Camilo's trust, and that was worth more than all the money and documentation and professional credibility in the world. Okay, Juan said, then that's what we'll do. We'll fight, together. The legal battle that followed was brutal. Mariella filed for emergency guardianship, claiming Juan had kidnapped Camilo and was preventing necessary medical care. Juan filed his own petition, arguing that Mariella had committed medical fraud and child endangerment. Both of them hired lawyers they couldn't really afford. Both of them drained their savings. Both of them prepared to go to war. The preliminary hearing happened 2 weeks later. Juan and Camilo on one side, Mariella on the other, their lawyers arguing over who had the right to make decisions about an 18-year-old who was technically an adult but legally still dependent due to his disability. Mariella looked professional, composed, every bit the responsible parent. She testified about the sacrifices she'd made, the long hours she'd worked to support the family, the medical expertise she'd brought to managing Camilo's complex care. She painted Juan as a well-meaning but unstable man who'd become paranoid and was now putting their son at risk by denying him access to his established medical team. Juan's lawyer countered with Dr. Mendez's testimony, with the evidence of the delayed surgery, with the financial analysis showing suspicious billing patterns. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. The judge wanted more time, more investigation. He appointed a guardian ad litem to assess the situation to determine what was truly in Camilo's best interest. That guardian ad litem was a social worker named Patricia O'Brien, a woman in her 60s who'd seen every kind of family dysfunction imaginable. She interviewed Juan and Mariella separately. She reviewed medical records and financial documents. She spent time with Camilo, talking to him privately about his life, his relationship with each parent, his own wishes. And then she did something unexpected. She recommended that Camilo be given the choice. At 18, Camilo was old enough to have a say in his own guardianship. If he could clearly articulate his preference, if he could demonstrate understanding of the situation, the court would give his opinion significant weight. The hearing where Camilo testified was the hardest day of Juan's life. His son, in his wheelchair, speaking carefully into the microphone, explaining to a room full of strangers why he wanted to live with his father instead of his mother. "My dad has been there every day," Camilo said, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. He does my exercises with me. He knows what I need before I ask for it. He believes I can get better. My mum, she's successful and smart, and I love her. But she's never there. And I think maybe she didn't want me to get better. I think she liked things the way they were. Mariella's face crumpled at that. For the first time in the entire process, she looked genuinely hurt. Camillo, no, that's not true. I wanted what was best for you. Then why did you delay my surgery? Camillo asked, turning to look at her directly. Why did the doctors tell me I could have recovered more if we'd done it right away? I was trying to make sure we made the right choice. I was trying to protect you by keeping me in this chair. Camillo gestured to his wheelchair. By making sure Dad had to give up everything to take care of me. By building your career while we struggled. That's not fair, Mariella said, her voice breaking. I was supporting us. Someone had to. Someone had to because you made sure Dad couldn't work. You made sure I needed constant care. You made sure everything depended on you. The judge intervened before things could escalate further, but the damage was done. Camillo had made his preference clear. 3 days later, the judge issued his ruling. Camillo would live with Juan. Mariella would have visitation rights, but major medical decisions would require agreement from both parents, or, if they couldn't agree, approval from the court. And there would be a further investigation into the medical fraud allegations. The case was being referred to the State Medical Board and to the U.S. Attorney's Office for potential criminal charges. Mariella walked out of the courtroom without looking at Juan or Camillo. Her lawyer was already talking about appeals, about fighting this decision, about not giving up. But Juan could see it in her face. She knew she'd lost. Not just the legal battle, but her son. She'd gambled that Camillo wouldn't turn against her, that his loyalty to his mother would outweigh everything else. She'd been wrong. That night, back in the apartment that was now just Juan and Camillo's, father and son sat together in the living room. Camillo was exhausted, emotionally drained from the testimony. Juan was too, but he was also relieved. They'd made it through. They'd survived. Dad, Camillo said quietly, what Mum said about you using my disability as an excuse, was that true? Juan thought about it carefully. Maybe a little, he admitted. Not the way she meant it. But I did let taking care of you become my whole identity. I did stop thinking about who I was outside of being your caregiver. That wasn't your fault. That was my choice. But it wasn't the healthiest choice for either of us. What are you going to do now? I'm going to help you get better. We're going to work with Dr. Mendez and find the best physical therapy program we can afford. We're going to give you every chance to recover as much function as possible. And then what? When I don't need you as much anymore? Juan smiled. Then I figure out who Juan Vega is when he's not just Camillo's dad. Maybe I go back to fixing cars. Maybe I do something completely different. But I'll figure it out. With you cheering me on instead of depending on me, that sounds pretty good. Actually? Camillo nodded, looking thoughtful. I think I want to be a doctor like Dr. Mendez, someone who actually looks at patients and sees what's really wrong. I think you'd be great at that. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the apartment quiet around them. It wasn't a happy ending exactly. There was still too much pain, too much betrayal, too much uncertainty about the future. The investigation into Mariella was ongoing. The divorce that would inevitably follow would be messy. The relationship between Camillo and his mother, if it survived at all, would take years to rebuild. But they were free. Free from the lies, from the manipulation, from the cage that Mariella had built around them. Free to move forward, to heal, to become whoever they were meant to be. That was something. That was enough for now. The investigation into Mariella's conduct took 8 months. During that time, Juan and Camilo built a new life. Dr. Mendez connected them with a specialist who believed Camilo could indeed recover more mobility. The physical therapy was brutal, more intensive than anything Camilo had done before, and there were days when he wanted to quit. But Juan was there, encouraging, supporting, never pushing too hard, but never letting Camilo give up either. 4 months in, Camilo took his first independent steps without a walker. Just 10 steps across the living room, but he did it. He and Juan both cried. 6 months in, Camilo could walk 50 feet with minimal assistance. He still used the wheelchair for longer distances, for conserving energy, but he was mobile in a way he hadn't been in 7 years. The financial investigation concluded with mixed results. There wasn't enough evidence to prove criminal fraud. The choices Mariella had made were within the bounds of what a layperson managing medical care might reasonably do, even if they weren't optimal. But the medical board found that Mariella had overstepped her authority in several instances, making decisions that should have been made by licensed physicians, and that some of the billing practices she'd used were questionable, if not technically illegal. She didn't go to jail, but her reputation was damaged. She left her job at the hospital, whether by choice or by request, wasn't clear. She started working as a freelance consultant, but struggled to get clients. The medical community in Chicago was small enough that word got around. Juan and Mariella's divorce was finalized on a grey Tuesday in March, almost a year after that morning when Juan had discovered the empty envelope. They divided their assets, minimal as they were. Mariella kept the apartment. Juan and Camilo moved to a smaller place in a cheaper neighborhood. Custody wasn't an issue anymore. Camilo was 19 now and made his own choices. He chose to see his mother once a month, stiff, uncomfortable visits, where they made small talk and avoided discussing anything meaningful. Juan went back to work, not at Rodriguez Auto Repair, but at a smaller shop closer to their new apartment. The owner was an old friend who needed help and was willing to work around Juan's schedule so he could still take Camilo to therapy appointments. It felt good to work with his hands again, to solve mechanical problems that had clear solutions, to be Juan the mechanic again, instead of just Juan the caregiver. Camilo enrolled in community college, taking classes in biology and chemistry, prerequisites for eventually applying to medical school. He still used a wheelchair sometimes on bad days or for long distances, but he could walk independently most of the time. He had friends, a social life, a future that looked nothing like the limited one everyone had assumed he'd have. So that's where everyone stands now. Juan and Camilo building something new, scarred but healing. Mariella alone in that apartment, successful, career destroyed, relationship with her son damaged perhaps beyond repair, living with the consequences of choices she'd made in what she probably thought were everyone's best interests. Was she a monster? A calculating villain who deliberately kept her son disabled for financial gain? Or was she a woman under impossible pressure who made bad choices that snowballed into something she never intended? Was Juan a hero? A devoted father who sacrificed everything for his son? Or was he someone who used his son's disability to avoid confronting his own failures, who built his identity around being needed and feared what would happen if that need disappeared? Was Camilo a victim, an innocent boy whose childhood was stolen by his mother's ambition? Or was he also someone who benefited from his father's complete devotion, who had a parent willing to give up everything for him, who gained something even as he lost something else? The truth, as it almost always is complicated. People are complicated, families are complicated, and 7 years of choices and consequences and small betrayals and noble sacrifices don't fit neatly into categories of right and wrong. You've heard everything, every detail, every complication, every perspective. So now it's your turn to decide who was wrong here. Was anyone fully right? Or is this one of those situations where everyone made mistakes, where everyone bears some responsibility, where the real villain isn't a person, but the circumstances and pressures and human flaws that pushed a family to the breaking point? I'm not going to tell you what to think. You're the jury. You've seen all the evidence. Now it's time to deliberate. But before you render your verdict, let me show you something. Let me give you the tools to understand not just what happened, but why. Because this story, as personal and specific as it is, isn't unique. The dynamics that played out in the Vega family play out in thousands of families every day. And if you understand the psychology behind it, if you can name the patterns and recognize the warning signs, maybe you can spot it in your own life before it's too late. So let's do a forensic psychological autopsy of what you just witnessed. Let's examine the machinery underneath this family drama. Let's expose the specific psychological weapons that were deployed, consciously or unconsciously, and understand exactly how they work. You've heard the story, you felt the confusion, the anger, the heartbreak. But do you know exactly what happened to your brain just now? Do you understand the specific manipulation tactics that were in play? Because once you can name them, once you understand their mechanics, you'll never miss them again. The primary psychological weapon in this story is something called medical proxy control. And it's one of the most insidious forms of manipulation precisely because it masquerades as love and dedication. Here's how it works mechanically. Step 1 is establishing expertise. The manipulator positions themselves as the only person who truly understands the complex situation. In this case, Mariella leveraged her medical billing background to become the family expert on healthcare systems, insurance, treatment options. She translated medical jargon for Juan, managed all communication with providers, controlled the flow of information. This created a dependency where Juan had to rely on Mariella's interpretation of what doctors were saying, what treatment options existed, what was possible versus what wasn't. Step 2 is incremental decision-making. The manipulator doesn't make one big choice that's obviously wrong. Instead, they make hundreds of small choices, each one defensible in isolation, but collectively steering toward an outcome that benefits them. Delay the surgery by 3 days. Set therapeutic goals slightly lower than optimal. Choose providers who are less aggressive about recovery. Miss a few appointments here and there. None of these choices by themselves would trigger alarm, but over 7 years, they add up to a fundamentally different outcome than what should have happened. Step 3 is exploiting legitimate complexity. Medical situations are genuinely complicated. There are always multiple valid approaches, trade-offs between aggressive treatment and quality of life, judgment calls about risk versus benefit. A skilled manipulator uses this legitimate complexity as cover. Every choice can be defended as reasonable. Every outcome can be attributed to the unpredictability of medicine rather than to calculated decisions. It's nearly impossible to prove that someone chose the wrong treatment on purpose when medical professionals themselves disagree about optimal approaches. Step 4 is emotional entanglement. The manipulator ensures that questioning their choices means questioning their love, their dedication, their sacrifice. Mariella worked long hours to support the family. She managed all the complex medical paperwork. She advocated with insurance companies. How dare anyone suggest she wasn't doing everything possible for her son? Any challenge to her medical decisions became a challenge to her role as a devoted mother, which made those challenges feel cruel and ungrateful. Now here's what you might have missed on first listen. Go back to the early part of the story, to those first months after Camilo's accident. Remember how Juan described feeling lost and overwhelmed? How he made mistakes at work because he couldn't focus? How Mariela took charge because someone had to. That wasn't just context. That was step one being deployed. Mariela wasn't necessarily being malicious in that moment. She might have genuinely been trying to help, but she was also establishing the pattern that would define the next 7 years. She was the competent one. She was the one who understood. Juan was falling apart and needed her to manage everything. Once that dynamic was established, every subsequent choice reinforced it. Juan made a mistake at work. That proved he wasn't reliable, that Mariela needed to be in control. Juan questioned a medical decision. That just showed he didn't understand the complexity, that Mariela's expertise was necessary. Juan wanted to be more involved in treatment discussions. That was sweet but impractical. These conversations required medical knowledge he didn't have. And here's the truly insidious part. Mariela probably believed she was doing the right thing. That's what makes medical proxy control so effective. The manipulator often genuinely thinks they're helping, protecting, making the best choices for everyone. They've convinced themselves that their control is necessary, that without them everything would fall apart. They're not villains in their own story. They're heroes carrying an unfair burden. But the impact on the victim is the same whether the manipulation is conscious or unconscious. Juan lost his agency. He lost his ability to participate meaningfully in his son's care. He became an executor of Mariela's decisions rather than a partner in making them. And that loss of agency, that reduction to a helper rather than a decision-maker, that fundamentally changed who he was, which brings us to the second psychological concept you need to understand, caregiver identity fusion. And this one is primarily on Juan. Here's what happens. Someone you love suffers a terrible injury or illness. You step up to care for them because that's what love means. You make sacrifices, you rearrange your life, you become whatever they need you to be. And at first, that feels noble and right and necessary, but gradually, insidiously, something shifts. Your identity as a caregiver stops being something you do and becomes something you are. You're no longer Juan who is currently caring for Camilo. You're Juan the caregiver, full stop. Every other aspect of your identity, mechanic, husband, individual with dreams and interests, those fade into the background. The caregiver role consumes everything else. And here's the trap. Once your entire identity is built around being needed, around caring for someone who can't care for themselves, you have an unconscious investment in maintaining that need. Not because you're cruel or selfish, but because without it, you don't know who you are. Your purpose disappears. Your value evaporates. You become obsolete. Mariela's accusation during that phone call, as vicious as it was, touched on this truth. She said Juan was happy to become Camilo's caregiver because it gave him an excuse for his own failures, gave him purpose and meaning he couldn't find elsewhere. That was harsh. That was designed to hurt. But it also wasn't entirely wrong. Juan had let being a caregiver become his entire identity. He'd stopped imagining a future where he wasn't needed in that role. And on some unconscious level, the prospect of Camilo becoming independent was terrifying because it meant Juan would have to figure out who he was without that defining purpose. This doesn't make Juan a bad person, it makes him human. We all construct identities around our roles, parent, professional, caregiver, provider, and when those roles are threatened, we often resist the threat, even if the change would ultimately be positive. We grip tighter instead of letting go. Now watch what happens when you combine these two psychological patterns. Mariela using medical proxy control to maintain decision-making authority, and Juan experiencing caregiver identity fusion that made him unconsciously invested in being needed. These patterns reinforced each other perfectly. Mariela's control gave Juan a clear role, the devoted caregiver executing her expert decisions. Juan's identity fusion made him reliable in that role, someone who wouldn't push back or demand equal say in decisions. Mariela got to maintain her expertise and authority. Juan got to maintain his purpose and identity. And Camilo, tragically, remained the person around whom this entire dysfunctional system revolved. No one in this system was consciously trying to harm Camilo, but everyone had unconscious motivations that made them resistant to his recovery. Mariela had built her career advancement around the expertise she'd gained managing his case. Juan had built his entire identity around being his caregiver, and Camilo, the actual victim in all of this, was trapped in a wheelchair longer than necessary because the two people who loved him most had unconscious investments in keeping him there. This is what systemic family dysfunction looks like. It's not usually one person being evil. It's multiple people with understandable motivations making choices that collectively create an outcome no one would consciously choose. It's a web of enablement and resistance and fear and love all twisted together until you can't separate the good intentions from the harmful impact. And here's why this matters beyond this one family's story. Because medical proxy control and caregiver identity fusion aren't rare, they happen all the time. Anytime someone has authority over another person's medical care, there's potential for this dynamic. Parents caring for children, adult children caring for aging parents, spouses caring for each other. The power differential created by illness or disability, combined with the genuine complexity of medical decision-making, creates perfect conditions for manipulation, even when no one intends to manipulate. So how do you protect against it? How do you make sure that if you're ever in a caregiving role, or if someone is caring for you, these dynamics don't take hold? First, insist on transparency. Medical information should never be filtered through one person. If you're the patient, you speak directly to doctors, you review your own records, you make your own decisions to whatever extent you're capable. If you're the caregiver, you facilitate access rather than controlling it. Second, maintain outside perspectives. Bring other people into medical appointments. Get second opinions. Talk to friends and family who can offer objective views. Don't let the caregiver-patient relationship become isolated and insular. Third, question expertise claims. Yes, medical situations are complex, but complexity shouldn't be used as a weapon to shut down questions. If someone tells you that you can't possibly understand, so you should just trust them, that's a red flag. Good medical professionals explain things in ways patients can understand. They encourage questions. They welcome involvement. Fourth, preserve identity outside the caregiving role. If you're a caregiver, you need to maintain relationships, interests, activities that have nothing to do with the person you're caring for. You need to remember who you are separate from that role. Because if you lose yourself entirely, you become emotionally dependent on being needed, and that dependency will unconsciously influence your choices. Fifth, pay attention to whose needs are actually being prioritized. In a healthy caregiving relationship, the focus is always on the patient's well-being and recovery. If you notice that decisions are being made primarily to accommodate the caregiver's schedule or preferences or emotional needs, that's a warning sign. Yes, caregivers matter. Yes, their well-being is important. But in a caregiving context, the patient comes first, period. And finally, watch for resistance to independence. If the patient is getting better, becoming more capable, needing less help, that should be celebrated. If instead you see the caregiver finding reasons why the patient still needs them, creating obstacles to independence or setting expectations low, pay attention. That resistance might be coming from unconscious fear of losing purpose rather than from genuine concern about the patient's abilities. These aren't foolproof protections. Even with awareness, these dynamics can creep in because they're rooted in deep human needs for purpose, identity, and control. But awareness helps, naming the pattern helps, understanding that this is a known dynamic rather than a unique, personal failing helps. Now let's talk about the evidence that should have tipped people off earlier. because there were red flags all through this story that everyone missed or dismissed. And if you know what to look for, you'll never miss them again. Red flag number 1 is isolation through expertise. This one looked like love at first. Mariella taking charge of medical communications because her English was better, because she understood medical systems, because Juan was overwhelmed. But watch what it actually accomplished. It isolated Juan from direct communication with providers. It made him dependent on Mariella's translations and interpretations. It ensured that all medical information flowed through her filter. The test for distinguishing between helpful expertise and controlling expertise is simple. Does the expert facilitate your own understanding and involvement, or do they replace it? When Mariella translated medical conversations for Juan, did she explain what the doctors said and encourage him to ask follow-up questions? Or did she summarize quickly and move on, making it clear that she had this handled and he shouldn't worry about the details? If someone's expertise is genuine and helpful, they want to teach you. They want you to understand. They want to build your capacity to participate in decisions. If someone's expertise is about control, they want to maintain your dependency. They want you to need them. They want to keep themselves indispensable. Action point. If you're in any situation where someone is acting as an intermediary between you and important information, whether that's medical, legal, financial, whatever, insist on direct access. Sit in on the appointments, read the documents yourself, ask your own questions. The intermediary can help translate and explain, but they shouldn't be your only source of information. If they resist your direct involvement, that's your red flag. Red flag number 2 is goal setting without input. Remember how the story mentioned that Camilo's therapeutic goals were set low, focused on maintaining his condition rather than improving it? That's not a bug. That's a feature of medical proxy control. Because if the goals are low, it's easy to meet them, which makes the caregiver look competent and successful. And it creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you tell a patient they probably won't recover much function, if you structure therapy around maintaining rather than improving, then surprise, they don't recover much function. And then you can point to that lack of recovery as proof that your conservative approach was realistic all along. The reality is that human recovery is unpredictable and often exceeds initial expectations. People surprise doctors all the time. Bodies heal in unexpected ways. Determination and effort matter, but only if the goals are set high enough to push toward maximum recovery rather than settling for minimal stability. So watch for this. If someone is making decisions about medical treatment, therapy, recovery expectations, and they're setting the bar low without consulting the patient or involving them in that decision, ask why. Is it genuinely based on medical evidence that this is the maximum possible recovery? Or is it based on convenience, on making the caregiver's job easier, on managing expectations to avoid disappointment? Patients should be involved in setting their own recovery goals. Even pediatric patients, even patients with cognitive limitations. They should have input about how aggressive treatment should be, what trade-offs they're willing to make between discomfort and potential improvement. What quality of life looks like to them. If one person is unilaterally setting goals for another without that input, that's a red flag. Red flag number 3 is financial opacity justified by complexity. Medical billing is genuinely complicated. Insurance claims are a nightmare. EOBs are deliberately designed to be incomprehensible, but that complexity shouldn't be used to shut down questions about money. In this story, Mariella controlled all financial information related to Camilo's care. She dealt with insurance companies, she negotiated with providers, she decided what bills to pay and how. Juan trusted her to handle this because it was her area of professional expertise and because he was focused on caregiving. But that trust created an opportunity for Mariella to make choices that benefited her career using the knowledge she gained from managing Camilo's case without Juan ever knowing what she was doing. This is a vulnerability in any relationship where one person has financial control. Caregiver scenarios traditional marriages, any power differential. The person with control can always claim that it's too complicated to explain, that you just need to trust them, that questioning their decisions means you don't value their work. The protection here is radical financial transparency. Both parties need access to all financial information, even if one person is handling the day-to-day management. Bank accounts should be joint, or at minimum, both parties should have viewing access. Bills and statements should be reviewed together. Major financial decisions should require agreement from both parties. Yes, this is more work. Yes, it's less efficient than just letting one person handle everything. But efficiency is dangerous when it comes to money, because money creates motive, and motive enables all kinds of destructive choices that would otherwise be unthinkable. Red flag number 4 is emotional manipulation through sacrifice narrative. This is the one that probably made you the angriest during the story. Mariela's claim that she was carrying the financial burden while Juan selfishly focused on Camilo. Her accusation that Juan was using caregiving as an excuse for his own failures. Her weaponization of her own hard work as evidence that Juan should be grateful and trusting rather than suspicious and demanding. This is what manipulators do when they're caught. They don't defend the specific action being challenged. Instead, they attack the challenger's right to challenge. They reframe their past behavior as sacrifice rather than choice, and they position any questioning of that behavior as ingratitude or betrayal. Watch for this pattern. If you raise a concern about someone's choices and they respond by listing all the things they've done for you, all the sacrifices they've made, all the ways you should be grateful rather than critical, that's deflection. It might be unconscious, they might genuinely feel unappreciated, but it's still a deflection that avoids addressing the actual concern. A healthy response to a challenge looks like this. You're right to question that. Let me explain my thinking and let's see if there's a better approach. An unhealthy response looks like this. How dare you question me after everything I've done for you? Do you have any idea what I've sacrificed? The first response is accountable. The second is manipulative, even if the person doesn't realize it. Red flag number 5 is resistance to second opinions disguised as loyalty. Here's a subtle one that happened in the background of this story. When Juan occasionally mentioned getting a second opinion or seeing a different doctor, Mariela would find reasons why that wasn't necessary. Dr. Chen knows Camilo's case so well it would take too long to bring someone else up to speed. Insurance might not cover it, they just tell us the same thing we already know. All of these are practical-sounding objections, and in isolation, any one of them might be legitimate. But collectively, they accomplish one thing. They keep Camilo's care within a closed system that Mariela controls. They prevent outside perspectives that might question the treatment approach or notice discrepancies in the records. Loyalty to providers is good when it's based on quality care. It's bad when it's used to prevent scrutiny. The difference is how the loyalty is framed. Is it about the patient's relationship with the provider, or is it about protecting the current system from disruption? If someone resists second opinions, resists bringing new providers into the care team, resists any change that would introduce outside perspectives, ask why. What are they actually protecting? The patient's continuity of care, or their own control over information? So those are your 5 red flags. Isolation through expertise, goal setting without input, financial opacity, justified by complexity, emotional manipulation through sacrifice, narrative, resistance to second opinions disguised as loyalty. If you see one of these, it might be innocent, might just be someone trying their best in a difficult situation. But if you see multiple flags, if you see a pattern, if you feel that something is off, even though you can't quite articulate what, trust that feeling. That discomfort exists for a reason. Your subconscious is picking up on patterns that your conscious mind hasn't fully processed yet. And here's the thing about these red flags, they don't just apply to medical situations. They apply anywhere there's a power differential, parent-child relationships, boss-employee relationships, romantic partnerships, friendships. Anytime one person has more authority, more expertise, more control than another, these same dynamics can emerge. The specifics might be different. Instead of medical expertise, it might be financial expertise or technical expertise or social expertise. Instead of caregiving, it might be mentorship or guidance or protection. But the underlying patterns are the same. One person controls information and decisions, the other person is kept dependent and isolated. Questioning is treated as betrayal. Sacrifice is weaponized, outside perspectives are resisted, and the impact is the same too. The person with less power loses agency, loses identity, loses the ability to advocate for their own needs. They become a character in someone else's story rather than the author of their own. So now you have the framework. You understand medical proxy control and how it operates mechanically. You understand caregiver identity fusion and how it creates unconscious investments in maintaining dependency. You know the 5 red flags that should trigger your awareness that something unhealthy is happening. And with that framework, go back through the Vega family's story one more time in your mind. See how many moments take on new meaning now that you can name what was happening. See how the pattern reveals itself once you know what you're looking for. That moment early on when Juan made a mistake at work and Mariela took over medical management, that was isolation through expertise being established. That conversation when Mariela set Camilo's therapeutic goals low and Juan accepted her judgment, that was goal setting without input. Those years when Mariela handled all the insurance billing and Juan never questioned the details. That was financial opacity justified by complexity. That phone call where Mariela accused Juan of using Camilo as an excuse for his failures, that was emotional manipulation through sacrifice narrative. All those times Juan considered getting a second opinion, but Mariela found reasons to stick with Dr. Chen. That was resistance to second opinions disguised as loyalty. The pattern was there from the beginning. Everyone missed it, including Juan, including Camilo, including the medical providers who should have known better. They missed it because each individual moment seemed reasonable. It's only when you step back and see the whole pattern, when you understand the psychological machinery underneath, that it becomes visible. And that's why this analysis matters, not to assign blame retroactively, not to turn you into paranoid detectives seeing manipulation everywhere, but to give you the tools to recognize unhealthy patterns early before they calcify into systems that trap everyone involved. Because here's the truth, most manipulation isn't conscious. Most people who create these dynamics aren't villains twirling metaphorical mustaches. They're scared, overwhelmed humans trying to maintain control in situations that feel out of control. They're people who've convinced themselves that their way is the only way, that without their management everything will fall apart, that the control they're exerting is actually love and protection. Mariela probably genuinely believed she was doing what was best for Camilo. She probably genuinely believed that Juan couldn't handle the complexity of medical decision-making. She probably genuinely believed that her career advancement was necessary for the family's financial stability. The fact that these beliefs also served her own interests, that they maintained her authority and autonomy, that they allowed her to avoid the messiness of true partnership, that was just a convenient alignment of incentives. And Juan probably genuinely believed that sacrificing his career to care for Camilo was noble and necessary. He probably genuinely believed that being needed was the same as being loving. He probably never consciously thought, I want Camilo to stay disabled so I can keep my purpose. But unconsciously, the fear of losing that purpose might have made him less aggressive about pursuing recovery options, less questioning of Mariela's decisions, more accepting of a status quo that felt safe, even if it wasn't optimal. This is how families destroy each other while believing they're protecting each other. This is how love becomes suffocation, how care becomes control, how sacrifice becomes a weapon. And it happens slowly, incrementally, through 10,000 small choices that each seem reasonable in the moment, but collectively create something toxic. The only defense is awareness, is the ability to step back from your own emotions and incentives and honestly assess whether your choices are actually serving the person you claim to be helping, or whether they're primarily serving your own needs for control, purpose, identity, autonomy. And that assessment is hard. It requires the kind of brutal self-honesty that most people avoid. It requires admitting that your motivations might be more complex and less noble than you want to believe. It requires accepting that good intentions don't automatically create good outcomes, that you can genuinely love someone while also making choices that harm them. But it's necessary, because without that self-awareness, without that willingness to question your own narratives and examine your own patterns, you will replicate these dynamics. You will become the person in someone else's life who seemed loving but was actually controlling, who seemed devoted but was actually self-serving, who seemed protective but was actually suffocating. And you won't even know you're doing it. Just like Mariela probably doesn't fully understand what she did wrong even now. Just like Juan probably still struggles with the realization that his identity as a devoted caregiver came at a cost to his son's recovery. So that's the real lesson here. The real verdict you need to render isn't about who was right or wrong in the Vega family. It's about yourself, about whether you're willing to look honestly at your own relationships, your own patterns of control and dependency, your own ways of using love as justification for choices that primarily serve you. Are you willing to do that work? Are you willing to question your own narratives? Are you willing to accept that maybe, just maybe, some of the ways you've been showing up in your relationships aren't as healthy as you thought? Because if you are, if you're willing to engage in that kind of radical self-examination, then you have a chance at building relationships that are truly balanced, truly healthy, truly based on mutual respect rather than hidden power dynamics. And if you're not willing, if you'd rather maintain your comfortable narratives about how you're just trying to help, just trying to care, just trying to do what's best, then you're at risk of becoming the antagonist in someone else's story. The person they'll look back on years later and realize was manipulating them even if you never intended to. The choice is yours. So here's my final charge to you, the jury. You have the facts. Juan and Mariela's marriage, Camilo's accident, the 7 years of care that might have been based on falsified or exaggerated medical information, the discovery that tore their family apart. You have the motive. Mariela's need for control and career advancement potentially conflicting with Camilo's recovery. Juan's identity fusion around caregiving, potentially creating unconscious investment in Camilo remaining dependent. You have the evidence. The missing medical records, the delayed surgery, the low therapeutic goals, the financial patterns, the resistance to outside perspectives. Now you must decide, is this a tragedy of errors where well-meaning people made understandable mistakes under enormous pressure? Or is this calculated manipulation where Mariela deliberately kept her son disabled for personal gain? Is Juan a hero who sacrificed everything for his son? Or is he someone who used his son's disability to avoid confronting his own failures and fears? Is Camilo purely a victim? Or did he also benefit in some ways from his father's complete devotion, from being the center of his family's universe, from never having to face the challenges of independence? There's no single right answer. That's the point. That's what makes this case worth deliberating. Because life isn't clean, families aren't simple, and most of the time, everyone involved is simultaneously victim and perpetrator, hero and villain, right and wrong. The verdict that matters isn't whether Mariela was wrong or Juan was wrong or who hurt whom more. The verdict that matters is what you take from this story into your own life. What patterns you'll watch for, what questions you'll ask, what kind of relationships you'll build based on what you've learned here. So I'm handing the gavel to you. The court is adjourned. See you in the comments.